My boss humiliated me in front of the entire company. Then my wife walked into his office and said 3 words. The words left Richard Blackstone's mouth at exactly 3:17 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon in the main conference room, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Seattle, and enough space for all 83 employees of Apex Digital Solutions to witness my professional execution. He stood at the head of the table in his custom-tailored Navy suit, pointing at the quarterly projection slides I'd spent 6 weeks preparing, and said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "This is what happens when you promote someone beyond their capabilities. Michael here has just cost us the Bergman account, worth $2.3 million, because he apparently can't grasp basic market analytics that a college intern could understand." The room went silent. Not the awkward silence of people unsure whether to laugh at a bad joke, but the thick, suffocating silence of witnesses to a public flogging. I stood frozen at the back of the room where I'd been setting up the video conference equipment, my hand still holding the HDMI cable I'd been connecting, watching 83 pairs of eyes turn toward me with expressions ranging from pity to schadenfreude to relief that they weren't the target. I'd been the director of strategic development at Apex Digital Solutions for 3 years, employed there for 8 total, worked my way up from junior analyst to running a team of 11 people who respected me, trusted my judgment, delivered results that had grown our client base by 340% since I'd taken the role. Richard Blackstone, 51 years old, founder and CEO, had hired me personally back in 2016 when the company was just 23 employees working out of a renovated warehouse space. He'd called me a rising star. He'd given me increasingly complex projects, larger teams, better clients. 6 months ago, he'd stood in this same conference room and announced my promotion to director, called me the future of the company, said I embodied everything Apex stood for: innovation, integrity, results. My wife Natalie had been so proud. We'd celebrated that night at Canlis, the fancy restaurant overlooking Lake Union that we'd only been to twice before, both times for major anniversaries. She'd ordered champagne and told me she always knew I was destined for great things. I'd believed her. I'd believed Richard. I'd believed in the trajectory of my career and the stability it provided for our family. The Bergman account was real. Bergman Industries, a multinational manufacturing conglomerate looking to overhaul their digital infrastructure, $2.3 million contract for a 3-year partnership. I'd been working on the proposal since January, meeting with their team weekly, customizing our approach to their specific needs, coordinating with our development team to ensure we could deliver everything we promised. Last week, I'd presented our final proposal to their C-suite in a video conference that lasted 2 hours and included detailed demonstrations of our proprietary software solutions. The presentation had gone well. Their CFO, Margaret Downing, 28 years in corporate finance, had asked pointed questions about scalability and security protocols. I'd answered everyone with specifics, with data, with confidence backed by actual expertise. Their CTO, James Brightwell, had complimented our innovative approach to data migration. At the end, Margaret had said, "We'll have a decision for you by end of week. This is impressive work, Michael." I'd walked out of that conference room feeling like I'd nailed it. Sent Richard a detailed summary of the meeting with my assessment that we had an 85% chance of closing the deal. This morning at 9:42 a.m., I'd received an email from Margaret Downing. The subject line read, "Bergman Industries, Proposal Decision." My stomach had done a little flip of anticipation as I opened it. The body was brief and professional. "Dear Michael, after careful consideration, Bergman Industries has decided to move forward with a different vendor for our digital infrastructure project. We appreciate the time and effort your team invested in the proposal. The decision was based primarily on concerns about organizational stability and leadership consistency raised during our due diligence process. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Best regards, Margaret Downing, CFO, Bergman Industries." I'd read it 3 times trying to parse what organizational stability and leadership consistency meant. Our company was stable. We'd been growing steadily for 8 years. We had low employee turnover, strong client retention, solid financials. What due diligence process had revealed concerns? I'd immediately forwarded the email to Richard with a note. "Just received this from Bergman. Not the outcome we hoped for. Do you have any insight into their concerns about organizational stability? Happy to discuss strategy for follow-up or potential re-engagement down the line." Richard's response had come back 11 minutes later. "Conference room, 3 p.m. all-hands meeting." That was it. No explanation, no discussion, no acknowledgement of the months of work. Just a terse command to appear at an all-hands meeting, which we typically only held quarterly or for major announcements. I'd spent the next 5 hours with a knot in my stomach, trying to focus on other projects, wondering what Richard would say, whether he'd want to debrief on what went wrong, whether he'd have insights I lacked. At 2:55 p.m., I'd walked down to the conference room. Employees were already filing in, looking confused. Nobody seemed to know what the meeting was about. I'd grabbed a spot in the back near the AV equipment, figured I might as well make myself useful setting up the presentation screen in case Richard needed it. At 3:03 p.m., Richard had strode in, wearing that navy suit he saved for important clients, carrying a leather portfolio folder. He'd gone straight to the head of the table, pulled up a presentation on the screen, and started talking about quarterly performance metrics without any preamble. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. His presentation had been methodical, almost hypnotic. Revenue projections, client acquisition costs, employee productivity metrics, market share analysis. Everything looked good. We were up 23% year over year. Client satisfaction scores were at 4.7 out of 5. Employee retention was at 91%. I'd started to relax slightly, thinking maybe this was just a routine quarterly update delivered at an odd time. Then Richard had clicked to a new slide, and my photo appeared on the screen, my official headshot from the company website, next to a giant red arrow pointing downward, and the words, Case Study, Leadership Failure. My blood had gone cold. The room had shifted. 83 people suddenly alert, sensing blood in the water. Richard had smiled that cold smile and begun his deconstruction of my competence, my judgment, my worthiness to hold my position. He'd pulled up the Bergman proposal, highlighted sections he claimed were amateurish, poorly researched, embarrassingly inadequate for a contract of this magnitude. He'd compared my work to proposals from previous years, ones he claimed were professional, thorough, successful. He'd shown a slide breaking down the $2.3 million projected revenue we'd lost, and how that translated to missed bonuses, delayed equipment upgrades, deferred hiring plans. This is what happens when you promote someone beyond their capabilities, he'd said. And those words had hit like a physical blow, beyond my capabilities. As if the 3 years of successful leadership, the dozens of closed deals, the team I'd built and mentored, the innovations I'd implemented that had streamlined our entire proposal process, none of that mattered. None of that was real. I was just someone promoted beyond my capabilities, someone who'd fooled everyone temporarily, but had finally been exposed for the fraud I apparently was. I'd felt my face burning, felt every eye in the room on me, felt my hands start to shake as I stood there holding that stupid HDMI cable like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. I'd wanted to defend myself, to point out the inaccuracies in his presentation, to explain that Margaret Downing's email had mentioned organizational stability concerns, not proposal quality issues. But my throat had closed up, and even if I could have forced words out, what would I say? Contradicting the CEO in front of the entire company would only make things worse. So I'd stood there, silent, humiliated, while Richard Blackstone systematically destroyed my professional reputation in front of everyone I worked with. Michael, do you have anything to say for yourself? Richard had asked, and his tone had been almost gentle, almost kind, which somehow made it worse, like he was giving me an opportunity to apologize, to grovel, to accept responsibility for this failure he'd constructed. I'd opened my mouth, then closed it. What could I say? The account was lost. That was a fact. Whether it was my fault or not almost didn't matter at this point. Perception was reality, and Richard had just created a perception that would follow me for the rest of my career at this company, possibly beyond. I'd shaken my head slightly. No, I'd managed to say, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. No, I don't. Richard had nodded as if this confirmed something. I appreciate your honesty in recognizing you don't have an adequate defense. I think we all need to learn from this. Confidence is important, but it has to be backed by competence. Moving forward, I'll be personally overseeing all major client proposals to ensure we maintain the standards that built this company. The implication was clear. I couldn't be trusted. My autonomy was gone. My authority was stripped. I was being publicly demoted, even if my title remained unchanged on paper. The meeting had continued for another 18 minutes. Richard had moved on to other topics, upcoming projects, a new client in the healthcare sector, revised vacation policies, normal business, as if he hadn't just publicly eviscerated one of his directors in front of the entire staff. People had taken notes. A few had asked questions about the new projects. Life went on. At 3:43 p.m., Richard had dismissed everyone. Back to work. Let's finish the week strong. The room had emptied slowly, people filing out in clusters, whispering to each other, carefully not looking at me. I'd stayed where I was in the back, still holding that HDMI cable, watching them leave. My team members, the 11 people I supervised directly, had all avoided eye contact. David Kowalski, my second in command, 15 years of industry experience, had paused near the door like he might come talk to me, then thought better of it, and left. I'd finally set down the cable, disconnected the video equipment with shaking hands, and walked back to my office on autopilot. My office was on the 3rd floor, a corner space with windows overlooking Puget Sound, one of the perks of my director position. I'd closed the door, sat down at my desk, and stared at my computer screen without seeing it. At 4:02 p.m., my wife Natalie called. I'd almost didn't answer, didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to explain what had just happened. But Natalie rarely called during work hours unless it was important. I'd picked up. Hey, I'd said, trying to sound normal. Michael. Her voice had been tight, controlled, the tone she used when she was managing extreme emotion. I just got off the phone with Sophie Brenner. She works in your accounting department. We met at the company holiday party. She called me because she was worried about you. She told me what happened in the meeting. Sophie Brenner, 34 years old, 5 years at Apex, friendly, chatty, Had spent 20 minutes at the December party telling Natalie about her rescue dogs. Of course she'd called. Of course the story was already spreading beyond the office. I'd felt something crack inside my chest. "It's fine," I'd said automatically. "It's not fine," Natalie had said, and her voice had shifted from controlled to something sharper, harder. "Richard Blackstone publicly humiliated you in front of the entire company over a lost account. That's not fine. That's not normal. That's not how professional feedback works." I'd tried to explain, tried to minimize it, tried to make it sound less awful than it had been. He was frustrated about losing a major contract. I was the lead on the proposal. It makes sense that he'd address it in a company meeting. Maybe I did make mistakes in the pitch. Maybe I wasn't as prepared as I should have been. Natalie had cut me off. "Stop. Just stop. Michael, I've been listening to you talk about the Bergman proposal for 6 months. You lived and breathed that project. You knew every detail of their infrastructure, their pain points, their budget constraints, their decision-making timeline. You coordinated with 8 different team members. You ran practice presentations. You prepared for every possible question. You told me last week after the final pitch that you'd never felt more confident about a proposal in your career. Now you're trying to tell me you weren't prepared?" She'd been right. I had been prepared. I'd been more prepared for the Bergman pitch than for any proposal I'd ever delivered. But preparation didn't guarantee success. Sometimes you did everything right and still lost. That was business. Except Natalie wasn't buying it. "What did the rejection email say?" "Exactly?" she'd asked. I'd pulled it up on my screen, read her Margaret Downing's message word for word. When I'd gotten to the part about concerns about organizational stability and leadership consistency, Natalie had gone quiet for a long moment. "That's not about your proposal," she'd said finally. "That's about your company, about Apex's internal issues. They did due diligence and found something that concerned them about the organization, not about your work." I'd frowned, staring at the email. "What kind of internal issues?" "We're stable. We're growing. Our financials are solid." "I don't know," Natalie had said, "but I'm going to find out. Where's Richard's office?" The question had caught me off guard. "What? Why? Where is his office, Michael?" Her tone had left no room for argument. "3rd floor, northwest corner. But Natalie, you can't just show up here. This is my workplace. I have to handle this professionally." "You tried handling it professionally," she'd said. "You stood there and let him destroy your reputation without defending yourself. Now I'm handling it my way. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She'd hung up before I could respond. I'd sat there staring at my phone, feeling a mix of dread and something else. Something that felt almost like hope, though I'd tried to suppress it. Natalie showing up at my office to confront my boss was insane. It would make everything worse. Richard would see it as unprofessional, as me hiding behind my wife, as proof that I couldn't handle business matters independently. It would confirm everything he'd implied about my inadequacy. But another part of me, the part that had been publicly humiliated 25 minutes ago, wanted someone to fight for me, wanted someone to look Richard Blackstone in the eye and call him out for what he'd done. Natalie worked as a senior investigative researcher for Morrison & Hale, one of Seattle's top corporate law firms. Wait, I can't use Morrison. Let me revise. Natalie worked as a senior investigative researcher for Whitmore & Hale, one of Seattle's top corporate law firms. She'd been there for 9 years, specialized in corporate malfeasance cases, financial fraud, executive misconduct. Her job was to dig into companies, find patterns of wrongdoing, build evidence that could survive legal scrutiny. She had access to databases most people didn't know existed, connections with regulators, forensic accountants, former SEC investigators. She was methodical, thorough, relentless. When she decided to investigate something, she didn't stop until she had answers. I'd seen her work on cases, had listened to her talk about uncovering shell companies and tracing offshore accounts and connecting seemingly unrelated transactions into clear patterns of corruption. She was brilliant at it, and now she was turning that skill set toward my boss and my company, and I didn't know whether to be terrified or grateful. I'd glanced at the clock. 4:09 p.m. 20 minutes meant she'd arrive around 4:30. I'd left my office, walked down the hall toward Richard's corner office, not sure what I was doing, just knowing I needed to be nearby when Natalie arrived, needed to intercept her before she did something that would get me fired on top of humiliated. Richard's office door had been closed, his executive assistant Beverly Chen not at her desk. Wait, I can't use Chen. Let me use Thompson. Beverly Thompson, 62 years old, 30 years of executive support experience, fiercely loyal to Richard, wasn't at her desk. Probably gone for the day. Richard typically stayed late, often until 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock p.m., working on strategy or client development. I'd hovered near the elevators, trying to look like I had a purpose for being on this end of the floor, checking my phone repeatedly, watching the time crawl. At 4:28 p.m., the elevator doors opened, and Natalie stepped out. She was still wearing her work clothes, a charcoal gray suit with a crisp white blouse, her dark hair pulled back in the professional bun she wore to court depositions, carrying her leather messenger bag that I knew contained her laptop and whatever files she'd grabbed before leaving her office. She'd looked calm, composed, completely in control. When she saw me, her expression had softened slightly. "You okay?" she'd asked quietly. I'd nodded, not trusting my voice. She'd squeezed my hand briefly, then looked down the hall toward Richard's office. "Which one?" I'd pointed. She'd walked straight to his door, knocked once, sharp and authoritative, then opened it without waiting for a response. I'd followed, my heart pounding, not sure what I was about to witness. Richard had been sitting at his desk, reading something on his computer, and he'd looked up with irritation at the interruption. "Can I help you?" he'd asked, his tone making it clear that whoever we were interrupting something important. Natalie had walked to his desk, set her messenger bag down on one of his visitor chairs, and looked him directly in the eye. "My name is Natalie Hayes. I'm Michael's wife. I'm also a senior investigative researcher at Whitmore and Hale, and I specialize in corporate fraud cases." Richard's expression had shifted from irritation to confusion to something that looked almost like amusement. "I see. And you're here because—" "I'm here," Natalie had said, her voice perfectly calm, perfectly professional. "Because you just committed a serious employment law violation by publicly humiliating my husband in a retaliatory meeting designed to undermine his professional reputation. I'm here to give you an opportunity to correct the situation before I file formal complaints with the EEOC and the Washington State Human Rights Commission." Richard had actually laughed. "Mrs. Hayes, I appreciate your loyalty to your husband, but what happened this afternoon was a standard performance review in response to a significant business loss. I have every right to address employee performance issues as I see fit." "No," Natalie had said. "You don't. You have a right to provide performance feedback through appropriate channels. You don't have a right to publicly humiliate an employee in a retaliatory all-hands meeting. And before you argue that it wasn't retaliation, I should tell you that I spent the last 20 minutes making some calls. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this." She'd pulled her laptop out of her messenger bag, opened it, turned it so Richard could see the screen. "I called Margaret Downing at Bergman Industries. We have mutual contacts through my firm. She was willing to speak with me off the record. Would you like to know what she told me?" Richard's face had gone still, carefully neutral. "I don't think that's appropriate. She told me," Natalie had continued as if he hadn't spoken, "that Bergman's decision had nothing to do with Michael's proposal, which their evaluation team rated as excellent. She told me their due diligence process uncovered concerns about Apex Digital Solutions' financial stability, specifically some irregularities in your corporate structure and capital allocation that raised red flags for their risk assessment team. She said they liked Michael, thought he did outstanding work, but couldn't move forward with a vendor whose parent company's finances didn't pass their scrutiny. She said, and I quote, "Michael Hayes delivered exactly what we asked for. Our concerns were entirely at the executive level." The silence in Richard's office had been absolute. I'd stood frozen near the door, watching this unfold, barely breathing. Richard's face had gone from neutral to flushed, a red creeping up his neck. "That's confidential client information. She had no right to share that with you. She shared her perspective as a professional courtesy," Natalie had said. "But it got me curious. So I made another call. I spoke with Leonard Vance, Chief Compliance Officer at Northwest Business Banking, where Apex holds its primary commercial accounts. Leonard Vance, 44 years old, 18 years in commercial banking compliance, known for being thorough and conservative in risk assessment. Natalie had met him during a fraud investigation 2 years ago when Whitmore and Hale represented a client in a dispute with one of Northwest Business Banking's corporate customers. They'd stayed in touch professionally. Leonard told me something interesting," Natalie had continued. "He said that Apex Digital Solutions recently restructured its corporate entity, creating a new LLC called Blackstone Ventures that now owns 60% of Apex's equity. He said this restructuring happened in January, that it changed Apex's ownership structure significantly, and that it raised some questions during routine account reviews because the restructuring seemed designed to extract equity from the operating company into a personal holding company. Leonard, being a compliance officer, filed a suspicious activity report with the state because the restructuring had characteristics consistent with asset stripping or pre-bankruptcy planning. That report would have come up in any serious due diligence process." I'd watched Richard's face go from flushed to pale. He'd opened his mouth, closed it, seemed to be recalibrating. "That restructuring was completely legal. I consulted with attorneys. I have every right to organize my company's ownership structure as I see fit. Legal and ethical aren't always the same thing," Natalie had said. "But here's where it gets really interesting. I pulled public corporate filings. Blackstone Ventures was registered on January 8th. The Bergman proposal process started in mid-January. You assigned Michael to lead it on January 19th. According to the meeting notes Michael sent you, which he forwarded to me, you were enthusiastic about the project, called it a game changer for the company, told Michael to pull out all the stops. Why would you do that if you'd just restructured the company in a way that would torpedo any serious due diligence?" Richard had stood up, his composure cracking. "I think you should leave. This is wildly inappropriate. You're making serious accusations without evidence." "I have evidence," Natalie had said calmly. She'd pulled a manila folder from her messenger bag, set it on his desk. "I had 20 minutes, so this is preliminary, but it's enough to show a pattern. In January, you restructured Apex to extract equity into a personal holding company. In February, you pushed Michael to pursue the largest contract in company history, knowing that due diligence would likely uncover the restructuring. In March and April, Michael delivered exactly what you asked for, worked nights and weekends, built a proposal that Bergman's team rated as excellent. Last week, Bergman rejected the proposal specifically because of concerns about organizational stability at the executive level, concerns that directly resulted from your financial restructuring. And today, you held an all-hands meeting to publicly blame Michael for losing the account, destroying his professional reputation to cover up the fact that your financial decisions cost the company $2.3 million. She'd paused, letting that sink in. That's retaliation. That's scapegoating. And depending on what else I find when I dig deeper, it might also be fraud. Richard had picked up the folder, flipped through the first few pages. Corporate registration documents for Blackstone Ventures. Excerpts from public filings showing the ownership restructuring. A printed email chain between Michael and Richard showing Richard's enthusiasm for the Bergman project. A printed copy of Margaret Downing's rejection email with the key phrase about organizational stability highlighted. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that Natalie wasn't bluffing, that she had actual evidence, that she knew how to build a case. "What do you want?" Richard had asked finally, his voice tight. "I want you to send a company-wide email by close of business tomorrow," Natalie had said. "The email will state that upon further review, the Bergman account loss was due to factors beyond Michael's control related to corporate structure decisions made at the executive level. The email will acknowledge that Michael's proposal was excellent and that he fulfilled his responsibilities with professionalism and skill. The email will apologize for the mischaracterization in this afternoon's meeting. And you will copy Michael on the email to HR, documenting that his performance on the Bergman project met or exceeded expectations. And if I refuse?" Richard had asked. "Then I file formal complaints with the EEOC and the state. I provide my research to Bergman Industries so they understand exactly why their due diligence raised red flags. And I share my findings with your board of directors and investors who might be very interested to learn about Blackstone Ventures and what it says about your confidence in Apex's future." Natalie had paused. "I'll also contact the other clients Michael has brought in over the last 3 years, all 11 of them representing $4.7 million in total contract value according to your own quarterly reports, and I'll let them know that the director who secured their business and manages their accounts is being scapegoated for executive-level financial decisions. I imagine some of them might have questions about Apex's stability. Client retention is important in your industry, isn't it?" Richard had stared at her for a long moment. Then he'd said 3 words, quiet and cold. "Get out now." But Natalie hadn't moved. "You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow. After that, I proceed with formal action. Your choice." She'd picked up her messenger bag, closed her laptop, turned and walked out of the office. I'd followed her, still in shock, not entirely sure what had just happened. We'd walked in silence to the elevator, ridden down to the parking garage, got into her car. Only when we were pulling out onto the street did I find my voice. "What did you just do?" I'd asked. "I gave him a choice," Natalie had said, her hands steady on the wheel. "He can take responsibility for his own decisions and publicly clear your name, or he can face legal and professional consequences. It's actually pretty simple. You threatened my boss," I'd said, still trying to process it. "You threatened to torpedo the company." I gave him accurate information about the consequences of his actions, Natalie had corrected. Everything I said was true. The restructuring is real. The due diligence concerns are real. The pattern of scapegoating is documented. I didn't threaten him. I just made him aware of what I know and what I'm prepared to do with that information. We'd driven home in silence. I'd replayed the confrontation in my head, watched Natalie walk into Richard Blackstone's office with complete confidence, lay out evidence I hadn't even known existed, back him into a corner with nothing but facts and the credible threat of exposure. It was the most incredible thing I'd ever witnessed. It was also possibly career suicide for me. If Richard decided to fight instead of fold, I'd be fired, blacklisted, reputation destroyed beyond repair. But as we'd pulled into our driveway, I'd realized something. My reputation was already destroyed. Richard had already done the damage that afternoon in front of 83 witnesses. Natalie hadn't made things worse. She'd just given me a chance at redemption, at having the truth matter, at not being the scapegoat for someone else's mistakes. That night, I'd barely slept. I'd lain in bed replaying both confrontations, the afternoon humiliation and the office showdown, wondering what would happen tomorrow, whether Richard would send the email or call my bluff, whether I'd still have a job by the end of the week. At 6:30 a.m., I'd given up on sleep, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. Natalie had come downstairs at 7:15, already dressed for work, looking calm and rested like she hadn't just threatened a CEO the day before. "You should go to work," she'd said. "Act normal. If he fires you, he fires you. But my guess is he won't. Bullies fold when you punch back." I'd arrived at the office at 8:30 a.m., taken the elevator to the 3rd floor, walked to my office expecting to find a termination notice or security waiting to escort me out. Instead, I'd found everything normal. My computer was on. My files were untouched. My team was in the conference room for our regular Friday morning meeting. David Kowalski had waved me in, looking uncomfortable but professional. I'd run the meeting on autopilot, discussed project timelines and client deliverables, acted like yesterday hadn't happened. Nobody mentioned the all-hands meeting, Nobody mentioned Richard's public evisceration of my competence. They all just quietly avoided the subject, which somehow felt worse than if they'd addressed it directly. At 11:47 a.m., my email pinged with a message from Richard Blackstone, sent to the all-company distribution list. Subject line, clarification regarding Bergman Industries project. My hands had been shaking as I'd opened it. The email read, Team, I want to provide important clarification regarding yesterday's discussion of the Bergman Industries proposal. Upon further review and conversation with Bergman's decision-makers, I've learned that their choice to move forward with a different vendor was not based on the quality of our proposal, which their evaluation team rated very highly. Rather, their decision was based on concerns about corporate structure changes made at the executive level in early 2024 that came to light during their due diligence process. These concerns about organizational stability were unrelated to the excellent work Michael Hayes and his team put into the proposal. The email had continued. I want to be clear that Michael fulfilled his responsibilities on this project with exceptional professionalism, thoroughness, and skill. The proposal he developed was comprehensive, innovative, and precisely tailored to Bergman's needs. The loss of this account reflects corporate structure decisions, not project execution. I apologize for the mischaracterization in yesterday's meeting and any confusion it may have caused regarding Michael's performance, which remains exemplary. Our company is fortunate to have directors of Michael's caliber, and I look forward to continuing to work with him on future strategic initiatives. Please join me in recognizing the outstanding effort he and his team invested in the Bergman proposal, even though external factors led to an outcome we didn't hope for. It was signed, Richard Blackstone, CEO. I'd read it 5 times, barely believing it was real. It was everything Natalie had demanded. Public acknowledgement that the loss wasn't my fault. Recognition of my work quality. Apology for the mischaracterization. Corporate speak carefully crafted to rehabilitate my reputation without explicitly admitting wrongdoing, but clear enough that everyone would understand what had really happened. Within minutes, my inbox had filled with responses. Teammates congratulating me on the recognition. Colleagues saying they'd known all along the proposal was solid. People I barely knew sending supportive messages. David Kowalski had appeared in my doorway at 12:03 p.m., looking relieved. That was quite an email. I'm glad Richard set the record straight. Yesterday was rough. We all felt terrible watching that happen. Thanks, David, I'd managed to say. I appreciate it. He'd hesitated. For what it's worth, everyone on the team knew the proposal was excellent. We all saw how hard you worked on it. Nobody believed yesterday's narrative. After he'd left, I'd sat at my desk, staring at Richard's email, feeling a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion. Natalie had done it. She'd walked into Richard Blackstone's office, laid out the evidence, backed him into a corner, and forced him to publicly clear my name. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like I was seeing my workplace clearly for the first time, understanding that the CEO I'd trusted for 8 years was willing to destroy an employee's reputation to cover his own mistakes, that he'd only done the right thing when threatened with consequences, that my career here would never be the same. I'd called Natalie. Did you see the email? I'd asked when she answered. I did, she'd said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Sophie from your accounting department forwarded it to me 30 seconds after it hit the company list. Apparently the whole office is talking about it. He did exactly what you demanded, because he had no choice. People like Richard only respect power. You showed up with facts and leverage, and he folded. I'd been quiet for a moment. What happens now? Now you decide whether you want to keep working for someone who'll throw you under the bus the moment it's convenient, or whether you want to explore other options. But either way, your reputation is intact. That was the immediate goal. She'd been right, of course. The email had cleared my name publicly, had reset the narrative, had restored my professional standing in the eyes of my colleagues. But working for Richard Blackstone after this felt impossible. How could I trust him? How could I invest in the company's success, knowing he'd restructured it in a way that suggested he was preparing to extract value and possibly abandon ship? How could I lead my team knowing the CEO had been willing to sacrifice me without hesitation? Over the next week, I'd started quietly reaching out to contacts in the industry, testing the waters, seeing what opportunities might exist. I'd updated my LinkedIn profile, subtle changes that wouldn't raise red flags internally but would signal to recruiters that I might be open to conversations. I'd had coffee with former colleagues who'd moved to other companies, asked about their experiences, whether their firms were hiring for strategic roles. I hadn't made any firm decisions, hadn't sent out applications, just gathered information and kept my options open. Meanwhile, things at Apex had shifted in strange ways. Richard had been cordial but distant, no longer dropping by my office for casual conversations about client strategy or industry trends, no longer inviting me to join client dinners or strategy sessions. It was like I'd become professionally radioactive, my value unchanged on paper, but my access to real influence quietly withdrawn. My team had noticed. At our weekly meeting 3 weeks after the email incident, David had asked if I was okay, said I seemed distracted, asked if there was anything they should know about leadership changes or project shifts. I'd assured them everything was fine, that I was just dealing with some strategic planning that required focus. It was technically true, even if the strategic planning was about my own career rather than Apex's future. 6 weeks after Natalie's confrontation with Richard, I'd received a message through LinkedIn from Dr. Patricia Ashford, Chief Operating Officer at TechVantage Solutions, a mid-sized firm specializing in enterprise software integration with about 200 employees and a reputation for innovation and strong corporate culture. Dr. Ashford, 52 years old, PhD in Business Administration from Northwestern, 25 years in technology leadership, had seen my profile and wanted to talk about their newly created position, VP of Strategic Development. We'd met for coffee at a neutral location downtown. Dr. Ashford had been direct, professional, and disarmingly honest. "I'm going to level with you, Michael. I've heard things through the industry grapevine about what happened at Apex. Richard Blackstone's reputation in certain circles is not what you might think based on his public persona. Several people I trust have told me he has a pattern of brilliant client work, followed by questionable financial decisions and employee scapegoating. When I saw your profile and realized you might be exploring options, I wanted to reach out." She'd paused, sipped her coffee. "I've also done my research on your actual track record. The Bergman proposal that supposedly failed. I know people at Bergman. I know what really happened. Your work was exceptional. The failure was entirely on Apex's corporate structure issues. I want someone who can deliver that level of quality for TechVantage, and I want to build a leadership team where that kind of work is recognized and rewarded, not used as a scapegoat." We'd talked for 90 minutes about her vision for TechVantage, their growth trajectory, their client base, their culture. Everything she'd described sounded like what I'd thought Apex was before the illusion shattered. Strong leadership, transparent communication, employee development as a priority, ethical business practices as non-negotiable. She'd made an offer on the spot. VP of Strategic Development, 30% salary increase over my current compensation, equity stake in the company, reporting directly to her, autonomy to build my own team and approach. I'd asked for a week to consider it, discussed it extensively with Natalie, weighed the risks of leaving a known environment for an unknown one versus the risks of staying somewhere my trust in leadership was permanently broken. Natalie had been characteristically direct. "You'll never trust Richard again. Every decision he makes, you'll wonder about the angle, the hidden restructuring, the potential fallout you'll be blamed for. That's not a sustainable way to work." Patricia Ashford's offer is solid. TechVantage's financials are transparent. Their reputation is clean. Sometimes the risk is staying, not leaving. I'd accepted the offer, given my notice to Richard with the standard 2 weeks transition period. He'd taken the news with professional courtesy that barely masked relief, like my departure solved a problem for both of us. My last day at Apex had been oddly anticlimactic. A small team lunch, handshakes, promises to stay in touch that we both knew were empty. I'd packed my office, turned in my badge, walked out of the building that had been my professional home for 8 years. Starting at TechVantage had felt like beginning a new chapter, one where my work was evaluated on merit, where leadership was transparent about corporate strategy, where mistakes were learning opportunities rather than ammunition for public humiliation. 6 months in, I'd closed 3 major contracts, including a $1.8 million deal with a healthcare consortium. Dr. Ashford had publicly credited my leadership in company meetings, had asked my input on strategic planning, had treated me like a valued partner rather than a disposable asset. 1 year after Natalie's confrontation with Richard Blackstone, I'd been sitting in my new office at TechVantage, corner space with natural light and a view of Elliott Bay, when my phone had buzzed with a news alert. Apex Digital Solutions files for Chapter 11, Bankruptcy Protection. I'd clicked through to the full article. It detailed how Apex had struggled with client retention issues following the departure of several key personnel, including their Director of Strategic Development, unnamed, but clearly me. How revenue had declined 35% over the previous 9 months. How the company's debt-to-equity ratio had become unsustainable following corporate restructuring that extracted significant capital into holding companies owned by CEO Richard Blackstone. How creditors were questioning the timing and nature of those restructurings. How the bankruptcy filing revealed that Blackstone had personally received $3.2 million in equity distributions from Apex in the 6 months before filing, distributions that were now subject to clawback provisions and potential fraud investigation. The article quoted Leonard Vance from Northwest Business Banking's Compliance Division, noting that suspicious activity reports had been filed months earlier regarding the restructuring, that red flags had been visible to anyone conducting proper due diligence, that this case highlighted the importance of financial transparency in corporate governance. I'd forwarded the article to Natalie with a simple message. "You were right about everything." Her response had come back 2 minutes later. "I know. That's why you married me. Also, Richard Blackstone just got exactly what he deserved. Karma's patient but thorough." I'd sat there thinking about the chain of events. How one moment of public humiliation had led to Natalie's investigation, which revealed corporate malfeasance, which gave me the clarity to leave, which apparently contributed to Apex's downward spiral, which exposed the financial house of cards Richard had been building. If he hadn't humiliated me that Thursday afternoon, if he'd just quietly accepted the Bergman loss and moved on, would any of this have come to light? Probably eventually, But maybe not before he'd extracted even more equity, left even more employees and creditors holding the bag. That evening, I'd come home to find Natalie in the kitchen making dinner, NPR playing on the radio. She'd looked up when I came in, smiled, saw the news about Apex. "You okay?" "I'm good," I'd said, and meant it. Mostly I just keep thinking about that afternoon in Richard's office. You walking in there with your laptop and your folder of evidence, backing him into a corner, making him admit the truth. 3 words you said to my parents when they called questioning our boundaries with your family. Do you remember? She'd thought for a moment. "Call my lawyer?" "You told Richard to get out now." 3 words, said with absolute certainty that you had the power and he didn't. That moment changed everything. Natalie had set down her knife, looked at me seriously. "Want to know what really happened that day? The full story?" I'd nodded. I'd been working on a corporate fraud case for the firm, completely unrelated to your situation. Company called Meridian Tech, CEO, was doing exactly what Richard did, restructuring to extract equity while running the operating company into the ground. I'd spent 3 months building that case, learning every trick in the book, every red flag, every pattern. When Sophie called me about your meeting, about Richard publicly blaming you for the Bergman loss, something clicked. The timing was too convenient. Major contract loss, public scapegoating, seemed designed to create a narrative where declining revenue was your fault, not systemic. So I called Margaret Downing, and when she mentioned organizational stability concerns, I knew. I'd seen that exact language in the Meridian case. Due diligence that uncovered restructuring that raised red flags. I called Leonard Vance because I knew Northwest Business Banking did Apex's commercial accounts, knew he'd be required to file SARs if he saw concerning patterns. Took me 15 minutes to confirm my suspicion. Richard was running the same playbook I'd just spent 3 months documenting in a different case. The evidence I showed him was preliminary, but it was enough because he knew I knew what to look for. Bullies only respect one thing, someone who understands their game and isn't afraid to call it out. I'd pulled her close, kissed her forehead. "Thank you, for fighting for me, for seeing what I couldn't see, for walking into that office with nothing but a laptop and 20 minutes of research and somehow making a CEO back down. You would have figured it out eventually," Natalie had said. "But you were in the middle of it, dealing with the shame and the shock. Sometimes you need someone who loves you to see clearly when you can't." 2 years after that Thursday afternoon meeting, I'd been promoted to Senior VP at TechVantage, leading a team of 35 people across 3 departments, overseeing $14 million in annual contract revenue. Richard Blackstone had been formally charged with fraudulent transfer and breach of fiduciary duty in the Apex bankruptcy case. The investigation had revealed he'd extracted over $5 million from the company in the 18 months before filing bankruptcy, all while maintaining public optimism about Apex's future and encouraging employees to invest in company stock options that became worthless. He'd settled with creditors for an undisclosed amount, agreed to permanent exclusion from serving as an officer or director of any public company, quietly disappeared from the Seattle tech scene. Some of my former Apex colleagues had landed at good companies, others had struggled. David Kowalski had reached out a year after I'd left, asked if TechVantage had any openings, said working at Apex after my departure had been unbearable, that Richard had become increasingly erratic and paranoid. I'd brought David in as a director, and he'd been excellent, grateful for the opportunity and the culture shift. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.